it's exactly how I introduced him a year ago when he spoke to us on the Fincastle resolution. So I apologize for not adding new material, but I figured, you know, as old as we're getting, none of us are going to remember what I said to him a year ago anyways, but actually I'm going on exactly what we had. Anyways. Eric and I were talking earlier, and it was just a delight. We share a lot of commonality, a lot of common views and ideas. We both love history. We both love the scholarly pursuit, and so it's just a joy whenever I get to hear him talk. I wish he'd join our board, but I think trying to lasso his feet and nail him to the ground is going to be a tough one. But maybe hope springs eternal. Keep that in mind. Eric Monday has family roots that have been in southern Virginia since the 1730s. He attended the university over there in Charlottesville for both undergraduate and law school, and lays claim to having lived in one of Jefferson's original lawn rooms during his final undergraduate year. He was Martinsville City Attorney from 2003 to 23, and is now General Counsel at the Roanoke Airport. Eric has served on numerous civic boards and is a Virginia Law Foundation Fellow, an honor granted to the top 1% of Virginia lawyers. He is also General Counsel for the Virginia Society of the Sons of the American Revolution and President of the Fincastle Resolutions SAR chapter here in Roanoke. He's a member of the Commonwealth of Virginia's Commission for the 250th anniversary of the American Revolution. His bio for tonight's lecture mentioned how he enjoys history, travel, his 1957 mahogany motorboat, and 1966 Lincoln convertible. I trust you still have both of those.
There you go, that'll break up.
If you've ever been to his house for any sort of formal celebration of our independence, he will light the cannon, and all the neighbors are used to this by now, but it is loud. He didn't mention that in his bio, but I'll throw that in. He's also proud to boast of his wife, Monica, who is executive board chair of Gentry Locke, and their son, who is probably now a senior at George Mason University and an aspiring lawyer. And he hadn't changed his mind yet. Okay, good. He's still hanging in there. He threw in that they share their Cave Spring home with two hideously spoiled rescue dogs. Now about tonight's lecture, let me turn this over to him. He writes, an initially hopeless campaign in 1778 through 79 probably resulted in one of the most lopsided victories in world military history. The future states of Ohio, Indiana, Illinois, Michigan, Wisconsin, and part of Minnesota became part of Virginia and enabled the new United States to double its size in the 1793 Treaty of Paris, ending that revolution. Today, this spectacular achievement gets barely a mention. And tonight, Eric says, we're going to explore this secret military mission by George Rogers Clark, leading 300 Virginia frontiersmen against the British and their Native American allies. A tale of remarkable courage, improvisation, and flashes of humor, set amidst the brutal realities of warfare on the American frontier. That is some amazing writing, and if his lecture is anywhere close to this, it's going to be a great evening. So thank you, Eric. Come on up here. Let's
All right, and welcome, State of the Union refugees. As you know, lawyers can talk about either side of an issue, so I'll give you three options. We can talk about this, or I can stand up here and tell you how brilliant and fantastic I am, or I can also tell you I'm a stark raving lunatic and the apocalypse is upon us. Those are your three options for listening to. So, but let's stick with this, which happened 247 years ago, the Battle of Vincennes this week. In fact, Vincennes fell tomorrow. So it's a really appropriate time for us to do this. And it starts out in Kentucky and Williamsburg, although the groundwork for that was really out here on the frontier even before that, because Virginia long laid claim to what became the Old Northwest. And didn't really matter up until the French and Indian War because the French were in the way, right? Everything to the west of us was part of France, or New France. Administratively, it belonged to Louisiana, France, and was administered largely out of New Orleans. But with the victory in the French and Indian War, all that changed. The French left North America. The British drove them out. They reassigned this to the province of Quebec. And if you'll remember some of the other revolutionary history, in 1763, right there at the end of the French and Indian War, King George issued the proclamation of 1763, which told the settlers, you can't settle west, essentially, of the Blue Ridge. The line ran right down through the middle of Main Street up in Blacksburg. He was a little late to the game there. He did that to protect his new Native American subjects from incursion from the western white settlers of the eastern seaboard, because that had created a great deal of friction already, and that was the reason for that Proclamation Act. The king felt an obligation to his Native American subjects. But a little late to the game, there were already thousands of people who had settled to the west of that line, including my own ancestors, and I'm sure the ancestors of a lot of people in this room. In fact, there was already significant settlement out in Kentucky, which is where we find George Rogers Clark. And there was significant interest, not just in Virginia colonists, but in the wealthier elite colonists throughout the 13 colonies in land speculation out to the west, not least of which was George Washington. Remember, he started out as a surveyor. He did a lot of his surveying way out beyond that 1763 proclamation line. And so he and a lot of the other landed gentry of Virginia were very significantly interested in the colonization of the West. To use a popular culture reference from the British side, if you remember the movie The Patriot, which is really horrible history, but there's that scene when Tabington, he's the stand-in for Evil Tarleton, remember, he's talking with Cornwallis about his brutal acts in the Revolution. He says, what am I to do? And Cornwallis says, well, once this war is over, there's going to be this new aristocracy. And Tabington says, points to a map and he says, tell me about Ohio. Well, a lot of people were interested in Ohio and Illinois. Here in Virginia, we call it Illinois. They wanted that land out to the west. And we were not the only state that wanted it. A lot of Virginia's claim was based upon, which is interesting since we really pressed the claim in the Revolution, but our claim had been based upon a grant from Charles II. We're called the Old Dominion because we remained a loyal colony to the crown during the English Civil War, and after they chopped off Charles I's head, and you had the protectorate for a while, and then Charles II came back in the Restoration, he rewarded Virginia by saying, you extend to the west infinitely, all the way to the Mississippi and beyond. The problem was that English monarchs at various times had told a lot of the colonies essentially the same thing. The Carolinas, Pennsylvania, New York, Rhode Island, of course, was just left out of the mix, but there were a lot of states that had claims to that land to the west. And so, 1778, Virginia decides we're going to press that claim. Part of it was certainly to get the British, to drive them out of North America, but there were ulterior motives there. They wanted to stake that claim for Virginia, all that land for the West. We're going to beat out the Quakers of Pennsylvania. We're going to beat out those Yankees from New York. We're going to get this land for ourselves. So the idea originated really from George Rogers Clark, who we'll talk a little bit more about him in a second, but he's out leading the Virginia militia in Kentucky, and he comes to Williamsburg for a secret meeting, which would have occurred in the governor's palace there with then Governor Patrick Henry, George Mason, and Thomas Jefferson. And what they discussed was an expedition to go out and conquer that land for Virginia, drive the British out, and you stake that claim to the Commonwealth to all that land because it's ours, because this king that we don't want anymore gave it to us. And this is a pretty good representation of what Clark looked like at that time. He was in his 20s, handsome man, auburn hair. He had been born at a place called Buena Vista right outside of Charlottesville. This place still exists. If you go to Charlottesville and you take Route 20 up towards Montpelier, about 5 miles north of the Ravenna River Bridge, these stone gate posts is what you see from the road, and further back on the property is this cabin, which would have been George Rogers Clark's birthplace, and they do have that marker that was erected by the homeowner to commemorate that. It's still a private residence. Here's 2 more representations of Clark. One is the one in the uniform is the image that we all have of Clark. That's a Charles Wilson Peale portrait when he did his whole series of Revolutionary War generals. But that was painted much later in life. Clark would not have looked like this at the time of the Revolution. He would have like this guy with homespun cloth and the auburn hair. He was a veteran of the Battle of Point Pleasant. If y'all remember any of that, that was from the fall of 1774, when the colonists out here on the frontier clashed with the Shawnee and Mingo, largely because of their incursions over that 1763 settlement line. Indians didn't really like that. And there was a big battle up at what is now Point Pleasant, West Virginia. That was during Lord Dunmore's War, our last royal governor. He called out the state militia, and they defeated the Shawnee and the Mingo at that battle. Andrew Lewis, another name most of us know here in Roanoke, was also one of the commanders at that battle. And they were not under the command of Governor Dunmore wasn't there, and nor were any other British officers. And they soundly defeated the Indians, and that gave the colonists out here on the frontier a lot of self-confidence that they were able to defend themselves without British leadership, which had not been the case in the French and Indian War a decade before. And that led to things like the Fincastle resolutions. But Clark had been a veteran of that battle, and by the time of the Revolution, he found himself commanding the Virginia militia out there in Kentucky County, which of course later became the state of Kentucky. And the settlers in Kentucky, which were just a few thousand settlers, Kentucky really wasn't big enough for them. They were also interested in moving north of the Ohio River into this Illinois territory, which, as Steve told you at the beginning, was what became, we here in Virginia called it all Illinois, but we're talking about Illinois, Indiana, Ohio, Michigan, Wisconsin, and part of Minnesota, all of it. They wanted that land. So what these 4 gentlemen agreed upon there at the Governor's Palace in Williamsburg was a secret expedition to go out into the Illinois territory and secure it for Virginia. Henry gave Clark a commission to command that expedition and authority to raise up to 350 troops. One other part of that conversation, which certainly came back to haunt Clark in his later life, was it's a secret mission. We don't want to tell the General Assembly about it. And so there will be no appropriation to fund this expedition. Would you be willing to fund it yourself? And the Commonwealth will reimburse you upon the successful conclusion of the endeavor. And Clark rather stupidly agreed to do that. Doesn't have a happy ending. And we will end on that note this evening. But he agreed to do that. And he raised his troops, mostly from Kentucky and also from the Great Valley around here and the Shenandoah Valley reaching all the way up into Fauquier County. And his commanders that he chose were 3 veterans of the Battle of Point Pleasant that he had come to know and trust very well. They wound up raising about 300 men, and they met up at what is currently, they all congregated up in West Virginia, crossed the mountains, crossed the Ohio River, and entered into the Illinois territory. This is just a representation of the frontier fighting that all of these men were used to. These are not going to be your blue-clad Continental soldiers dressed like George Washington and his troops. These are going to be frontiersmen in deerskin and homespun that have been used to pretty vicious fighting out here on the frontier. The battles out here are not like, again, what you saw in The Patriot with lines of beautifully uniformed men lining up and firing muskets at each other. This often was hand-to-hand combat where people got shot, or they got knifed, or they got tomahawked. Both sides took scalps and cut pieces off of each other as trophies. This was not a pretty war out here. So these were very hardened men who were really used to some pretty brutal fighting, which came to serve them well in the ensuing campaign. So they go out there into the Ohio, where they initially come into contact with, again, the Shawnee, who already are not particularly fond of white Anglo settlers from the eastern seaboard colonies. Also the Miami Indians, the Chippewa. At the time they formed what has been alternatively called the Northwestern Confederacy, the Miami Confederacy, but it was a number of different tribes, the most populous of which were the Wabash Indians that settled along the Wabash River Valley in Indiana. And they certainly did not have a Plains Indian headdress, and George Rogers Clark was certainly not wearing a Continental Army uniform. One, because he wasn't in the Continental Army. His commission was from the Virginia militia. So this is simply historical fantasy that any of the Indians would have looked like this, and any of the American troops would have looked like this either. Nor, as we'll learn in a minute, did they even have an American flag with them. So they enter into Ohio and they move on to Indiana, to what was sort of the capital. They captured a small village called Kaskaskia and Cahokia. You may have heard of the Cahokia Indian mounds. That was still not where the mounds are today, but those were two pretty significant frontier villages. But Vincennes at the time was the most significant village in the entire Illinois territory other than Detroit, which was the provincial administrative capital. And all of these towns would have been French. We're not, if you're thinking of the white settlers out here, they're not going to be English settlers yet. The English settlers wanted to move in that area, but to the extent there was white settlement, these were folks, they were leftovers from the French and Indian War. The French government had been driven out, the French troops had been driven out, but the French inhabitants remained somewhat reluctant British subjects. But Vincennes would have been a French Catholic village with a lot of Native American trading activity going on. And so that's what George Rogers Clark found when he came to Vincennes in late 1778. There weren't really even any British troops there. He just took control of this fort. This is Fort Sackville. It was named for George Germain, Lord Sackville, who was His Majesty's minister for the North American colonies. He was a very personal friend of George III, and to the extent, the British strategy that lost North America played out, that was largely the creation of George Germain, Lord Sackville. But this fort would have been named for him as the colonial secretary, and it's kind of your classic conception of a frontier fort. These are pretty accurate reconstructions based on archaeological digs. The town of Vincennes still exists out there in Indiana. And the only thing it's really lacking, from the western forts of our movie memories of youth is the tower on each corner. They just had it on opposite corners. But this is what it would have looked like. And so Clark takes the fort. They decide they need a flag, because they didn't bring any with them. And the stores in the fort did not have any white or blue cloth, but they had a ton of red and green. So this is the historic flag of George Rogers Clark. I'm going to brag for a minute, because Virginians brag. My middle name is Helms. The S was added sometime in the early 19th century. And this flag was designed by one of his captains, Leonard Helm. We didn't have the S on the end at that time, a collateral ancestor of mine. He's the one that came up with this. So, and he figures a little bit in this story. Virginians have to brag about this, and I will be candid with you. Other than this guy and a United States senator from North Carolina, it's kind of a tale of mediocrity for the ensuing 2.5 centuries for my family. So I'm going to brag on it a little bit. So they've taken Vincennes, and Clark leaves Captain Helms. They raise the flag, and he leaves Captain Helms in control of the fort, along with 2 Virginians and about 50 of the local French militia. And then Clark goes off to attack and conquer some other villages. They are invading the Illinois territory. So Helms is left there with 2 Virginians and the French militia. And about a week after Clark has departed, down from Detroit comes Henry Hamilton, the governor of this portion of the Quebec province on behalf of the king. He is a native Englishman, and he has come down to history, or at least our history, as being known as the hair buyer. He was based out of Detroit, and he did have some British regulars under his command, but for the most part out there in the West, it wasn't a lot of your classic red-coated lobsterbacks that we see in the East. It was very few British regulars, and most of the manpower that upheld British power were their Native American allies, who were sympathetic to the British Crown because they did know that King George had passed that Proclamation Act of 1763 and did feel that he had an obligation to their Indian allies. So, to be perfectly frank, most of the Native American population of this territory remained loyal to and allied with the forces of the Crown. So, and they were also motivated because Henry Hamilton gave a bounty for any scalp from a patriot. I don't know how you could distinguish between a patriot scalp and any other scalp, but if you brought the governor a scalp, he would pay you a couple of dollars in gold. And this, of course, infuriated the colonists, the patriots. This is a propaganda piece attacking Hamilton and his Indian allies, and it made the Virginians very motivated to, even more so than they would normally be, to conquer this territory. So Hamilton leaves Detroit and he comes down the Wabash with a flotilla of boats and some British regulars and a lot of Indians, and they arrive in front of the fort there in Vincennes in early 1779. And the French militiamen, being French, disappeared, promptly went home, and Captain Helms found himself in the fort with the 2 Virginians. So he told the other 2, you need to find Clark. We're going to lose this fort. I mean, this battle is over before it even begins. So you need to go find Clark, but before you go, before you slip out the back, let's load this cannon and roll it into the gate of the fort and find me a jug of whiskey. And Hamilton, and this is true, all of this is true, it's recorded in Hamilton's journals. Hamilton and his forces array themselves in front of the fort, and throughout the afternoon, Captain Helms got increasingly drunker, but stood there beside this loaded cannon with a lit linstock and bluffed them for a couple hours, while the 2 other Virginians safely made it away, off in search of Clark. And then later that afternoon, Henry Hamilton quite literally rode up to Captain Helms, who by this time was roaring drunk, and just took the linstock, the thing that you fire the cannon with, away from him, and realized at that point there was no one else in the fort. So at this point, Vincennes has fallen. I will say that a fondness for the jug also has a tendency to run in my family. I like this portrait. This comes out of a book called Amateurs at Arms. If any of y'all remember the old cartoon series Terry and the Pirates, it was written by the author of that strip. And it's just a collection of obscure little people of the Revolution who had interesting vignette stories. And during the bicentennial in 1976, my mother bought a copy of that book for me in Colonial Williamsburg. We didn't flip through it, discovered it on the ride home, My mother, this guy named Helm was in there, and my mother was all into genealogy because it was the bicentennial, and then she is the one that researched the collateral connection of this guy. But totally bought it random in the gift shop at Colonial Williamsburg. So the two guys wander off. I don't know how they ultimately found George Rogers Clark, but after a couple of weeks, they did in fact find him. Delivered the letter from Captain Helms telling him about the fall of the fort, and Clark decided at that point that the whole expedition was in danger because the primary town in the Illinois territory had fallen, and he told these men, we got to turn around, we got to go back, we got to take that fort. Again, we're talking about 300 men at this point, and it's about 600 to 700 British and primarily Native Americans that are back in Vincennes at that fort. And it's February. And the Wabash Valley tends to ice up in the winter, and so for about 2 weeks, Clark and his men trekked back through the wilderness of the Illinois Territory through the flooded and icy Wabash River Valley on very thin rations to make it back to Vincennes. This was essentially day and night trekking for a forced march that lasted about 2 weeks. And then during the week of the 20s of February, they found themselves, they did wade through icy water the whole bit. They find themselves in front of the fort at Vincennes. And I'll digress a minute and say during those few weeks, Henry Hamilton, he did write in his journals that apparently Captain Helms was a delightful guest. He apparently was very good at whist, and he was also very good at mixing ties. So Colonel Hamilton, Governor Hamilton, had become pretty fond of Captain Helms, and when they arrive at the fort, Rogers dispersed his men to completely surround the fort. Told them to build as many campfires as they possibly could to make an enormous amount of noise. And this would have been in the wilderness. There was a field, an open field around the fort, but beyond that was really thick woods. And so Hamilton and everyone in the fort could not really see, what was beyond the trees. They just saw campfire smoke all around them, with a lot of howling and hooping and hollering. And then the firing started. Captain Helms apparently told Hamilton that would be Clark, and he is here to take back the fort. So the firing continued for about a day. Again, with much display, a lot of show, but without a whole lot of effect. And then the following day, which would have been today, during that march back, Rogers had acquired a couple of prisoners who turned out to be the sons of several of the chiefs who were there in the fort with Hamilton. And on the second day, he ordered them brought out before the fort. And everybody's up on the ramparts watching all of this. And had them tomahawked to death in full view of the fort. And he's literally shouting up at the British and their Indian allies, and this was meant for the Indian allies, of course. The chiefs they're wailing the loss of their sons, and I doubt it was anywhere near this eloquent, but if you remember your Shakespeare, it's sort of Henry V before the gates of Harfleur. Will you yield and this avoid, or guilty in defense be thus destroyed? Why in a moment look to see your naked infants spitted upon pikes, your father's most reverend heads dashed to the walls? It worked at Harfleur, and it worked at Vincennes as well. Clark, probably in a much less eloquent way, said, I've just killed your sons, and if you don't surrender, I will do this to every single person in that fort. Hamilton sends out Captain Helms to parley on behalf of the fort. And even though he's friends with George Rogers Clark, And he sent him out there because he knew he was friends with George Rogers Clark. George Rogers Clark took one look at him and said, "You go back in the fort and you can take your fate along with the rest of them." And that really kind of clinched it, because the next day, Hamilton surrendered. He surrendered the fort, largely under pressure from his British allies. The ploy worked, and it was a ploy. I mean, there's no way that Clark would have ever been able to take this fort. He bluffed his way into it. This is a pretty famous painting. It hangs in the Indiana State Capitol. The original mural is at the George Rogers Clark Memorial at Vincennes. This was painted by an artist named F.C. Young, who actually became very famous for his paintings of the Spanish-American War, when he was an itinerant war correspondent and illustrator. Rode with Teddy Roosevelt and the Rough Riders. So he's the one that painted this one. Probably looked more like this, with sopping mud, and it literally was a case of they march out to surrender the fort, and Hamilton suddenly realizes, "Oh my Lord, I've I've surrendered this fort to a force half the size." And the Indians also realize that they've been tricked, but they also realize that they're kind of up against a brutal force of nature. And what had happened there in front of the fort cowed a lot of them, and a lot of them simply went back to their villages. But Vincennes had fallen, and so after that, Hamilton is sent back to Williamsburg in chains. He's a prisoner of war. He winds up in the jail that's been reconstructed there at Colonial Williamsburg. And Jefferson claps him in irons. And there is an enormous hue and cry in Virginia to try Henry Hamilton as a war criminal, which you didn't really do back then. Officers and gentlemen were typically immediately paroled and got to go back to the other side and either return to England or return to the fray. But Hamilton remained in Williamsburg until 1780, under constant threat of being tried for his life and hung as a war criminal, until Washington finally convinced Jefferson to release him on parole. He was sent back to Quebec for a few years, where he served as governor of what remained of the Quebec province. And then I'll tell you how he ultimately ended his career in a second. But, so that's what happened to Henry Hamilton. Fort Sackville was renamed Fort Patrick Henry in honor of guess who. And Clark continued with his conquest of the Northwest. And this is where it gets pretty dark. So the primary tribe in the Miami Confederacy were the Wabash Indians, the Indians who populated the Wabash Valley there. And Clark appeared before their war council with two wampum belts. One was red, symbolizing war. One was white, symbolizing peace. And he went there for a parlay and he said, "You can choose, war or peace. Which one is it going to be?" And the Indians chose war. And Clark gave it to them. Largely under the command of my ancestor, Captain Helms, they proceeded to burn to the ground every single Indian village in the entire Wabash Valley, shades of Sheridan and the Shenandoah Valley. They burned the villages to the ground. They burned all the crops. They killed every man that they could lay their hands on, and all the women and children were sent back to Virginia to be sold into slavery. And after that, the Native American population throughout the Northwestern Territory became largely inactive. So there were no real further military operations in this campaign. Clark considered an expedition to Detroit, but he never really followed through on that. There was a very small relief force that came down the Wabash Valley on a flotilla of boats that was defeated in what's called the westernmost naval battle of the American Revolution. But folks, these are rowboats. These are rowboats and muskets. This wasn't Trafalgar. And that was it. And at that point, the entire Northwest Territory, all of these states, and think about pretty much everything I've talked about occurred in what is currently the state of Indiana. But after that, the entire territory fell under American control, Virginian control. It became Illinois County. That's what the General Assembly formally brought it into the Commonwealth as by the end of 1779. So a little bit of epilogue here, and then we'll talk about the end of this story. So Hamilton, he was paroled and went back to Quebec, and then he wound up as governor, horrors, Bermuda, where the capital city is named for him, Hamilton. He lost half of British North America and comes out smelling like a rose. What happened to George Rogers Clark? You don't see this portrait of George Rogers Clark very often, do you? Was he ever repaid for the expedition? Not a single dime. He and his veterans were given pretty significant land grants by the Commonwealth. Of course, this was completely unimproved land, largely wilderness. And again, these are frontiersmen. They are not particularly sophisticated men, most of them. And what happened to most of those land grants was that more sophisticated speculators who populated the eastern seaboard bought the land grants from the veterans, and usually bought it in continental scrip, which was completely depreciated and largely worthless at that time. So the vast land that Clark had been given evaporated, and he soon found himself in extreme poverty. He took to drink. Another thing you don't often see about this portrait is this is actually a Spanish uniform. There was a time that Clark flirted with being in the Spanish service for pay because he was broke. He only did it for a few months and never saw any active military service against the United States, but he flirted with treason there for a while. Later in his career, the General Assembly voted him a ceremonial sword in thanks for his service to the Commonwealth. And when it arrived at his home out in Kentucky, he wrote the General Assembly, thanked them very kindly for the sword, but told them that money to buy bread would have been more appreciated. And he wound up at Locust Grove, which was not his house. He essentially lived in a grace and favor father-in-law suite room at this house. This was his daughter who married rather well. It is outside of Louisville. There's a big party there before Derby Day every year. But this is where he ended his days, but it most certainly was not his residence. He lived there at the sufferance of his wealthy son-in-law and ultimately essentially drank himself to death. But he got a postage stamp. The federal government gave him his 2 cents. See the yawn portrait there. His victory has lived on in 4 different naval vessels, all named USS Vincennes. Virginia honored him with one monument in Charlottesville. And this is no longer there. This was removed in 2020. At the same time, General Lee and General Jackson were removed. And there was some effort by the Sons of the American Revolution to suggest to the University of Virginia that George Rogers Clark was not a Confederate and should not be removed. But the university very strongly believed that he was mean to Indians, and he most certainly was. I will grant that. It is worth noting these were Indians that chose war, and they were allied with the English crown at the time. But nevertheless, University of Virginia removed this monument, and it remains wrapped in burlap in a University of Virginia warehouse to this day. Indiana is a rather different story. This is what they constructed. to the memory of George Rogers Clark, and this is now a United States historic monument. They erected that large rotunda where the original Jan did all of these portraits of the life of Clark, and there's that great bronze statue at the center. And it's an appropriate monument to the man and to his men, because the United States would have been half its size were it not for this conquest. This is a portrait of the Treaty of Paris that ended the revolution. It's an interesting portrait. The British delegation refused to sit for it. That's why you have this white blob there. The Americans were happy to sit. So you've got John Jay and Benjamin Franklin, and I think John Adams was part of that delegation, but none of the British delegation would sit for it. And possession being 9/10 of the law, that is why the British agreed for the Northwest Territory to be recognized as part of the United States. The king may have felt some compunction for his Native Americans, but the Native American subjects of the king were frankly completely screwed over at the end of the revolution. The king abandoned them. So they were left to the tender mercies of the United States, which were not very tender. These states that came into the Union, initially as the Northwest Territory, Virginia abandons its claim to be Illinois County about the time of the adoption of the Articles of Confederation. And the Ordinance of 1787, which was drafted largely by Thomas Jefferson, who certainly has a complicated history with slavery, nevertheless said that this would become a territory of the United States without the institution of slavery. Which is why, when these ultimately became states, they entered the Union as free states. So you do have Jefferson to thank for that. The relationships with the Indians continued to be pretty horrific throughout the 1780s, with a lot of warfare that very similar to what had already characterized warfare on the frontier, with two really big battles that kind of ultimately resolved that issue. There was the Battle of Fallen Timbers in 1794, where the Native American Confederacy, the Miami Confederacy, defeated a force of regular United States troops under the command of General Arthur St. Clair. That was the biggest defeat of an American force by Native Americans until the Little Bighorn in 1876. Arthur St. Clair was disgraced for the remainder of his career. And then sporadic warfare continued until 1811, when the Northwest Territory was finally pacified or stolen, depending on who your ancestors are, at the Battle of Tippecanoe, where William Henry Harrison, another Virginian, defeated primarily Shawnee. There weren't, frankly, many Wabash Indians left by then. And then after that, as you see from the dates on here, it was really after the Battle of Tippecanoe was when these states could safely become states, and the territory was carved up into what ultimately became these free states of the Old Northwest. Again, as free states, and mostly the inhabitants of those states, along with Pennsylvanians and New Yorkers, is what brought emancipation and reunification back to Virginia just about 3 decades later. So that's how that story plays out. We actually use this as the symbol for the Fincastle Resolutions chapter. Kind of represents those settlers out on the frontier with Fort Patrick Henry in the background and the Native Americans that they defeated at their feet. It's not a very pretty story, but that's how these states ultimately became part of the United States. And I'll be happy to answer any questions.
I have a question about logistics. You talked about the imbalance of forces at Vincennes that was revealed at at the final coming out there. And what then becomes do the occupying force that's surrendering leave? Where do they go? And then do Clark's men occupy that fort for a while, or do they go on to the next encounter or battle or whatever?
Well, it would have been similar to what it was before. Clark would have left. It wasn't Captain Helms at that point, because at that point he's off in the Wabash Valley killing Indians. But he would have left a garrison of 2 or 3 Virginians. There are journal entries that indicate after the fort surrendered, the French militia red town. And at that point, they're quite willing to come back and help man the ramparts. Hamilton and his officers were sent back to Williamsburg. The other officers were paroled, Hamilton was not. And the very few British regulars were actually released on parole immediately, and they sailed back up to Detroit. The Indians, as I said, largely evaporated. Their will to continue, the ones that had been at Vincennes, their will to continue fighting at that point largely ceased, and word started to spread. That wampum trick was tried on a number of other tribes, and particularly after the Wabash Valley had been laid waste. The other tribes decided they'd take the white milk.
When Washington chose to put Hamilton on parole, was that as a part of an exchange, or was it just Washington's sense of honor?
It was primarily a sense of honor. He had been working on Jefferson for months and just said, I realize this man is reprehensible, but this is not who we are. This is not how we treat captured officers. There was some appeal to Jefferson that, if we do this to him, then you can expect it to be done to our officers. Of course, to a certain extent, it was already being done to our officers with prison halls, New York Harbor. But Washington simply did not want to go down that route.
Thank you. It was a very good speech. It's interesting when the king said no further west, save that for the Indians. Didn't Dunmore's war actually kind of break that, even though that he was the governor? He was like, I want this land for myself?
Yes, absolutely. And Dunmore's war is a fascinating little thing. And when you look at Lord Dunmore, he goes from immensely popular in October of 1774. He wasn't out there at Point Pleasant, but it was his war. And he defeats the horrors of the brutal savages, and he calls out the state militia, and they have defeated the Shawnee and the Mingo. That's October of 1774. And these same men, by January of 1775, are writing the Fincastle resolutions that say we're willing to die, to fight and die in liberty. That's a pretty rapid deterioration. And then by June of 1775, because Fincastle happens in January, Patrick Henry gives, and it didn't happen out here in a vacuum. I'm not going to repeat my speech last year, I promise, because I'm trying to. But it happens out here on the frontier. But David Campbell, who was clerk of Fincastle County, was smart enough to send dispatch riders. So within less than a week, it's in the Virginia Gazette. In less than 2 weeks, it's pretty much known up and down the eastern seaboard, and then you have resolutions just like it cropping up everywhere. So by Patrick Henry's speech in March, and 2 of the signers of the Declaration were married to sisters of Patrick Henry. Follow that thread. So by March, you've got the House of Burgesses saying, do we call out the militia to defend our liberties as Englishmen? And Patrick Henry gets up and says, give me liberty or give me death. Following month, you've got news of Lexington and Concord. Dunmore gets a little nervous, takes all the gunpowder out of the magazine there in Williamsburg, which really ticks the colonists off. St. George Tucker goes to Bermuda and smuggles black powder back to Virginia, but sends most of it up to the siege of Boston. And so, liberty or death would have been death. if it weren't for that gunpowder incident, because there would have been no powder for the muskets. The militia comes down there to Williamsburg. Things are really dicey until June, when there's a confrontation in the streets of Williamsburg, and someone's like, oh, "Governor, did I shoot you in the leg?" And Dunmore leaves and never returns. So from October of 1774 to June of 75, you essentially have a total collapse of royal authority in Virginia. Dunmore tries to come back, loses the Battle of Great Bridge. New Year's Day of 1776. By this point, he's literally living on a flotilla of ships out in the Chesapeake Bay. They fire a couple of cannonballs into Norfolk to kind of get the attention of these horrid rebels. A couple of cannonballs that started maybe one or two fires, and the Patriots, who hated the nest of Tories and Jewish merchants that was Norfolk, decided to help things along, burn the city to the ground, and turn it into a propaganda victory by blaming it on Dunmore. And then in May, before any other colony, we declare ourselves independent, May 15th in Williamsburg. But to go from probably our most popular governor before the Revolution, except maybe Lord Botetourt, to the last royal governor, it's just an amazing spot. Dunmore had a lot to prove. He was a Scotsman, and his father had been a traitor. He fought with Bonnie Prince Charlie at the Battle of Culloden, and so Dunmore had a lot to prove. He wanted to, he was going to prove himself more loyal than any other Tory loyalist to King George, and he completely flubbed it.
Thank you.
Yes, sir.
So I just moved out here from Norfolk, and we still have a cannonball in the church. So,
Well, you've been burned. I mean, you've been burned twice.
yeah, right.
We love burning Norfolk.
Yeah, it's been working. In the Civil War, the mayor met the Union forces outside and said, "Here's the key to the city." So, when I was at Dorset at the Battle of Great Bridge, great. If you ever go that way, it'd be nice to see. But so why did the British, when they went back to Detroit or whatever, why did they? Was it just honor? Why wouldn't they come back and try to take that fort when they realized it was really not a big force?
Well, because from the standpoint of the regulars, the British regulars, they also had a tiny force, and their Indian allies were evaporating. Because back then it would have taken these guys quite a while to get back up to Detroit, and in the meantime, the Wabash Valley had been burned end to end, and they go back a few British regulars, and it was a very paltry force that was defeated at that westernmost naval battle of the Revolution. But they had already discovered coming down the Wabash that their Native American allies were not there for them anymore at that point. They stayed in their villages. They were not going to have happen to them what had happened to the Wabash.
And your read of this was the way Clark handled that next phase with the Wabash Indians part of a bigger strategy, or was he sort of making this up as he goes along? Because we see now in hindsight how that did tie into the British not wanting to come back. And what you said also stood out to me is that the shock value of that destruction sort of prevented other Indian nations from joining in, and it sort of just calmed that whole. I don't know what
there isn't anything in Clark's papers to indicate that he went there with the intention of doing that. I think it was just the improvisation of war.
Improvisation.
And he arrived in front of Vincennes. He saw that he was outnumbered, and I think the decision to tomahawk those captives. I mean, he knew that they were the sons of the chiefs of the fort. I think that was a pretty brutal but largely spur-of-the-moment decision to achieve victory at any cost. He knew he wasn't going to achieve it with the forces at his disposal, so he'd already engaged in a great deal of subterfuge by saying light all these campfires, shoot from as many directions and make as much noise as you can, but I think he knew that it was going to take something pretty dramatic to achieve that victory. And the combination of killing these boys and sending, his best friend back into the fort to accept his fate, definitely got the attention of everybody up there on that stockade watching what was happening. Wabash Valley Indians the same way. Of course, again, I don't think it can be underemphasized that a tradition of pretty brutal warfare on the frontier had been long established for decades by this point. But the Wabash was, we're not talking about the burning of a single village. It was the brutality of the frontier taken to its natural extreme. We're not burning this one village and killing everybody in it. And both sides did that sort of thing. This was, we are going to exterminate this tribe from one end to the other. And that had not happened before. Essentially genocide. And yeah, that gets people's attention.
Chilling effect is the word I was trying to refer
Oh, terror.
to. Any other questions as we wrap up? It's been a wonderful talk. I'm so appreciative. Thank you so much.
Well, thank you all.